Welcome to The Weekly Word, a 52-week journey through the Bible. My name is Matt Lidikanen, and with me is Steve Lampy, and we are both Christian pastors currently serving at Messiah Church in Midland, Michigan, and we're excited to be journeying with you through the Bible. Every week, we'll be taking a big picture view of the scripture you'll be reading, point out some points of interest along the way, and together gain a better vision of the God who loves us. This podcast follows along with the daily readings found in the one-year chronological Bible reading plan and resources from Tyndale House Publishers.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We're in week 22, and that means we are fully in Proverbs. And being in the Proverbs, like I said in the Psalms, Steve, it's like the worst way to read the Proverbs. Better if you were to go through the Bible in a year and then, rather than, we're in the chronological method. Mm-hmm. And so we're kind of just, Solomon, we just finished reading about his life a little bit. Mm-hmm. And so this is just, Solomon wrote these. And so we're getting all the things that Solomon wrote. But of course, Proverbs doesn't read like an article or like a storybook. It's just one-liners.
Just
it's like one-liner after one-liner.
Yeah,
it's like that's a good nugget.
Yeah,
So it'd be more fun to chew on one every day, and then that's it.
Yeah, and your readings may find one that sticks out to you.
Yeah,
that's kind of how when I read Proverbs, that's kind of there's sections that I wouldn't say necessarily intertwine with each other through the whole thing, because it's pretty. He can talk about one thing and then immediately the next verse dropping wisdom about a totally different thing. But just finding in that section that one thing that really kind of pertains to what you're learning, what you need to hear, because you typically, if you read a good section of Proverbs, you pick up quite a bit of good wisdom within it for your life. Yeah. So it's like a really good dad that just constantly tells you what you need to hear.
Yeah.
So
I'm gonna drop you some truth bombs, buddy.
Yeah. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes it's uncomfortable. It's like, oh, okay, Dad, I didn't hear that today, but okay. Yeah. Yeah.
So I think a couple things as readers are getting into the Proverbs. The first part, there's chapters 1 through 9 is it's like the prologue. It's sort of this set up as a conversation between a father and his son, and it's poetic. And this father is sort of admonishing his son to listen to his instruction. Don't forsake this. I'll read it just from chapter 1.
Yeah.
It says, "Listen to my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. They are a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck." So if I were to kind of cast us back, Deuteronomy, where God says through Moses, speak about the commands of God when you get up, when you lie down, when you're on the road, when you're at home. This is that sort of same thing. This is like the teaching of God, the wisdom of God, and it's being applied in everyday situations. So the Deuteronomy 6 is kind of like big picture stuff, and then we get down into the more nitty gritty everyday marriage, love, money, whether we engage in violence or justice, and what does that all look like, and how do we parse that out? And each kind of proverb has a little one-liner that unpacks that a little bit for us.
Yeah.
So that's the beginning, and then the rest of the book is all those one-liner proverbs. Same thing, same features you'll see in the Psalms. You'll have a lot of there's some similarities in the Psalms to the Proverbs, like this idea of the foolish person and the wise person. There is the parallelism, so it will say kind of the same thing, but like the inverse of it, like the righteous man does this, but the fool is this, and it's sort of like this compare contrast sort of parallelism going on. So that's kind of a feature to look out for. The other thing is the fool and the wise person. The fool, rightly understood, and it's right in the beginning Proverbs, a righteous person, a wise person is one who fears the Lord. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and that's the foundation. That's the cornerstone of one's life, to walk and follow the Lord and have a thriving life. The fool does not fear the Lord. So that's the primary differentiation between the wise man and the foolish man. And then I'm trying to think of other features here, but I mean, that's basically kind of the core.
Yeah,
That's what you need to know. That's what I was going to say. Proverbs are not promises. And by that, I mean, Proverbs, it's kind of like, hey, here's how life generally works.
Yeah.
This is, if you want life to go well, follow this wisdom. But it's not like sometimes people have misread, or I've heard it misread, like, oh, the Bible says, insert proverb here, so therefore this has to be true in every single case. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not exactly the right way.
If you think about Ecclesiastes and the way that's written too, if you were to take the general feel of the first, I think there's 12 chapters in the Ecclesiastes, I think the first 11 chapters of Ecclesiastes, and say, well, this is just how it is. It's pretty heavy toward the difficulties of the difficulty of reality of life, but that doesn't mean that this is how it always is. Solomon was explaining, just kind of, I think, like you're explaining with Proverbs, that this is truthful in life. There's brokenness. There's heaviness. There's, why would you even bother laboring, because you're just laboring in vain? That doesn't mean, well, look, I don't have to work because Solomon, in Ecclesiastes says laboring is just in vain. That's not what that's saying. And I think sometimes, when you read Proverbs, you can kind of get in that whole thing too. Like, oh, okay, so if I do this, and that's the outcome of it. That's going to be the guaranteed the outcome of it.
No.
Yeah, these are just words of wisdom. Generally, this is typically how life works out. I think there's really good wisdom for all ages in this, like from middle schoolers, elementary students, all the way to elderly. Some of these same wise truths are necessary throughout life. That's on, and we're going to get to some, and maybe when we talk more about it, I'll point it out. I'll be like, hey, look, that's for a little kid, that's for a grown man. So yeah.
And so I think as we go forward, now we're going to unpack some stuff. For this episode, we're just going to kind of grab a couple verses, because as you're reading along, you'll probably find a couple verses that just stand out to you. And you're like, oh, there's something, I really like that. There's some good wisdom there, and that really applies to my life situation. And we might not talk about the one that you resonated with deeply when you're reading, but we'll try and point out some good things along the way, and just expound on a couple as we go. But I really like the Proverbs 5-6, and it's warnings against adultery. So again, it's framed as his father to his son, and that he needs to really be careful. Of course, in this sort of this vision, he's painting this vision of a prostitute. So she's like on the street corner and kind of beckoning to those who walk by, which is not too commonplace. I guess depends where you drive, right? But not too commonplace nowadays, and it's something like everyone's going to be encountering this. But if you were to take the Proverbs 5 things, like it says, "Now my sons, listen to me. Do not turn aside from what I say." Verse 8, keep to a path far from her. Do not go near the door of her house, lest you lose your honor to others and your dignity to one who's cruel. And it goes on. How do we kind of guard our heart with respect to that?
Well, I think when you even say guard your heart.
In our modern times.
Yeah. I think guard your heart is a proverb of its own, correct?
It is, yeah.
Absolutely. I'm sure that we'll get to that point. So you read about this section, and when he talks about adultery, I think what we just said before you brought up chapter 5, this is for all ages. This isn't for like a specific time in life, like, oh, you really need to hear this right now. There may be seasons where you're struggling more so with that temptation than others. But I think even what Christ brought into the picture when you look at this proverb is that there's the physical act of adultery where you act upon it bodily, and then there's the heart issue of adultery where you just act on it within your heart. These are the things that you're struggling with, right? So the temptation that there is for men and women, both, to not necessarily, to engage physically in that with someone that is not that is not your wife or husband, that happens. But there's also this greater temptation, I'd say, at a wider range or wider opportunity that the world takes advantage of to just set their eyes on a image that can become a prostitute in a way that we objectify and we engage within our thought and entice those thoughts. And then what does enticement do? It leads to sin. It leads to lust. And I think that's what the Father's saying to the Son here. And what God would say to us as sons and daughters is, at all costs, don't grace that door. Like when you know that there's this point where you have to turn your eyes, walk away. Because what you brought up and I want you to share a little bit more about this, and we were talking before this, is that many times we think if it's not hurting me and it's not hurting someone else, then what's the problem with it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is the devil's best lie.
Mm-hmm.
It really is, because there's so many things that on the surface of the action, let's say, I mean, for me, when I look at this particular passage, immediately my mind goes to pornography and how common that is. There are so many men, and even like aspects of our culture that kind of like almost celebrate it, which I cannot get my head wrapped around, like with feminism being a voice that has spoken some good things into the culture. It's like women need to be valued and celebrated and have dignity and honor. And then there's other voices from the similar corner of the culture that are like, hey, if they want to use their body as an object, that's their right. It's like, wait a minute, is it honor or is it use and misuse, right?
Yeah.
It's just is messed up. But it's, keeping a path far from her, not going near the door of her house, and staying far away from it and getting away from anything, whether, what tempts you. So if it's going to be something as like, I don't know, Sports Illustrated, is it going to be a Victoria's Secret magazine, whatever, there are those kind of like, oh, that's not nudity. So let's draw a little near to the door. Like that's really keep a path far from her, toss out the magazines, like, install an app on your phone, whatever, or put your phone away, whatever it is, right? Like get away from that path. And the lie that the devil will tell, going back to what your question, it's like, well, who's it hurting? I'm not, engaging in anything. Maybe you're a married guy, maybe married gal. Well, it's not that I'm actually sleeping with somebody else. So what's the issue? I'm not hurting anybody, or I'm not getting in another person's bed, their marriage bed. Like, okay, time out. How is this impacting your intimacy with your spouse? Because if you're turning to those things to satisfy something, there's a lack there, a perceived lack or actual, and you're trying to satisfy and fill that with something else that's counterfeit, that's fake, that's phony. Proverbs chapter 5:15, later in the chapter, he says, drink water from your own cistern, running water from your own well. So if you're looking to have something in you, some desires satisfied, you're dissatisfied in some sense with the water in your own cistern, your own well. So like that's referring to your spouse.
Yeah, marriage, yep.
What would God invite you to do different? Because the devil's path is, it's not going to hurt anyway. You just go have another look, browse a little longer. Your wife doesn't need to know, and then you certainly get into all these sorts of terrible rabbit trails, and then you compound things. Like, I don't want to hurt her by telling her, so I'm just going to keep it to myself. And then because you keep it to yourself and you're ashamed, then you keep doing it. It's just, yeah. That lie is awful.
Yeah, and I think there's even studies done how that addiction that can actually become an addiction. Like there's certain like dopamine hits when these images kind of pop, and the more that you entertain those things, the more that it becomes I don't know what you call it, more of a habit, it becomes like wired within your brain to seek it out, right? So you're longing for those things. So it's interesting how our bodies spiritually and also physically can kind of, in the darkness and the sin, the physical is affected by that. So when we think it's not affected by that, sin affects the entire being. It really does. And so, for myself and yourself, this is something that all people really need to take great instruction in, with what Solomon's saying and what God tells us, because it does destroy, and it can affect a lot. It really can affect a lot, relationships, and it can affect I think just like you said, I think like when you talked about that shame part too as well, like living in shame is not where God wants people to be.
That's right.
And the amazing thing about a Christ is that He's not going to point a finger at you and say, look how worthless, and look how ridiculous, dirty you are. He's going to say, what you're settling for is garbage when I have the greatest treasure for you in me. Like I have such joy to offer you. I have such peace to offer you. And yet what you live in is shame.
Mm-hmm.
That's not his choice to give you. That's our choice to go after it. And that's what we go after when we open the door to it. We go after shame. We go after guilt. We go after condemnation of our own self. And so Christ offers mankind within those things to turn and say, I have joy, I have peace, I have good direction, and good things, perfect things from God. So that's the choice that we have within this. He's not going to push us away if we've been struggling with those things. He's going to welcome us to himself for forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he need, people need to hear too, as well. As you read this, here's some awesome wisdom on how to live, but know that you're going to need Christ to do it. As we all do.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah. You're not broken, too broken for God to love you, redeem you, and redeem your relationship. Because, like it or not, that's going to be the reality is, I just was reading from my daughter and I listened to the Chronicles of Narnia on the way to school, and we just listened to one part where one of the characters, he becomes a dragon, and he's been kind of a terrible person the entire time. And so it's in becoming a dragon in reality that he's just like, I've been awful. I can't believe how terrible I've been. And Aslan is the Christ figure in the book, and Aslan takes him to this pool where he's like, well, you need to undress. You got to take that dragon skin off. And he tries to do it himself 3 times. And then Aslan says, well, you're gonna have to let me undress you. And Aslan, and he's a lion. So he like sinks his claws deep into him and he just rips his skin off. And he's like, that hurt really bad. So Christ can free you from those kind of the dragonish types of behaviors, the lies of the devil.
Yeah.
But it will take some pain. But at the end of the day, when this character is thrown into the pool and is cleansed, he's like, I've been renewed. He's totally different, totally changed, and it impacts all of his relationships with the other characters the rest of the book.
Wow.
So
it's great imagery. That's cool.
Yeah, it's super rad. But there's a lot of cautions here. And I'm looking at the end of chapter 5. Your ways are in full view of the Lord. He examines all your paths, and that's a great reminder. In terms of, this isn't hurting anybody. This is the privacy of my own realm. God sees you. There's nothing that can be kept secret from him. And if you ever want to know, is something a sin or not? If you're kind of like in your own mind or like making all these mini self-justifications, I'm like, well, this is okay because of this. Or like on Google, like, when is it okay as a Christian too? You're begun from the wrong starting point.
You've already taken a toe over the line. If that's where you're at, there's something in you that is, it's almost like the sinful nature is trying to justify what your spirit already knows. Yeah.
And not to linger, I think we'll move on from this, but 5, 6, and 7 are really linger on on sexual ethics and sexual morality and what that, by avoiding it, what you can achieve for yourself. And if you fall into it, I mean, it's pretty straight up. He talks about this one guy in chapter 7. I saw among the youths a simpleton, and he was persuaded by this adulterous woman, and all at once he followed her. He says like this, verse 22, like an ox going to the slaughter, like a deer stepping into a noose. So it's like, this won't hurt me. No one's going to find out. And that's exactly what the woman tells him, in fact. She's like, my husband's gone on a long journey. No one has to know. It's just going to be in the privacy, just between you and me, baby. And all at once he followed her like an ox to the slaughter. So yeah, we'll put that to bed. But that's, it's super important that we can maintain our integrity on that, and we'll protect ourselves at the end of the day too. And Proverbs 8 through 10, we got wisdom crying out in the street, and she's just like making her case, like, you have to follow after me. If you follow me, you're going to find life. If you reject me, you will find death. It's kind of the same thing. Deuteronomy, I set before you today life and death. Choose life, please. Please choose wisdom. And you can think of what Jesus probably had the book of Proverbs memorized. Well, he wrote the thing, essentially, right, by the Spirit. So think of Jesus in Matthew chapter 7. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. So when Jesus says that, he has Proverbs in mind. He's kind of internalized all that and bringing that to bear. So let me get into chapter 10 and then on. I mean, we got a lot going on here. Do you see anything that you fancy? Like any favorites in there?
There's one that you brought up that I thought it would be pretty funny if you talk to your, it's that chapter 9, the one where no, that's chapter 10, I think. Where is it? No, not hatred stirs up confidence, but love covers over all wrongs. I think that's spoken a different way in a different version where love covers over a multitude of sins.
Are you thinking of chapter 21, verse 9, where it says, better to live on a corner of a roof than to share a house with a quarrelsome wife? Is that what you're thinking of? That's
the words in your mouth. I would never ever think that.
I would never
never say that.
Not
never,
my marriage.
ever. No. No. But yeah, so specifically within this chapter, verse 12 is great. Let's see, what other ones do I look around here? And I think this is the nice thing about Proverbs that, like you talked about before, that there's so many things that you could choose from. They're not all connected at all.
No, there's no straight connection. There's not like linear. It's like jumping around from one topic to another.
Here's one that you spoke of when we were talking before we started here. In verse 27 of chapter 10, the fear of the Lord adds length to life, but the years of the wicked are cut short. And we talked about the fear of the Lord. And we also talked about how these aren't necessarily like always universally like true. Like you can have the fear of the Lord in your life and things still happen. Life being cut short, we would immediately think like, okay, so the fear of the Lord, then I'm going to live long. So if I just fear the Lord, I'm going to give like 100 years on this planet. That's what's my guarantee there. That's not what this is saying. The fear of the Lord means that there's wisdom in the fear of the Lord, and to live wisely is actually a protection from the ignorance that we live in that can actually harm ourselves. Right? That's what this is saying here. It's not like to live foolishly is you put yourself in harm's way. That's the opposite of what he's speaking into our life. This is the desire to fear the Lord. The benefit of those things is a long life, meaning that your foolishness isn't going to be what kills you. So like these are the things where you read stuff like that, and it's exactly what you said in the very beginning. But there's a lot of fear of the Lord in Proverbs, and we just talked about that before we started.
What is fear of the Lord? What does that mean?
Yeah. We actually just talked about this last week on Sunday, just very briefly within the messages we talked. So fear is a weird word biblically. Fear in man's eyes typically defaults to one thing, which means you're scared and you're terrified. And I don't think you can disconnect that with God, because I think that in the end, there is a judgment that mankind should be apart from God, to reject God. There will be terror in the fear of the Lord in judgment. That's going to happen. But the fear of the Lord for those who know him is a different way of, I would say, and I think I talked about like this. You have a father that loves you. When my father disciplined me, there was a sense of I want to honor my father and how I live, and there was a healthiness, a healthy reverence, knowing that he has authority over me to discipline me, which kept me safe. And so the fear of the Lord kind of gives you those boundaries of what's good for you when you want to push them, to test those things. But the fear of my father here, even as I was little, was I know that my dad, I know what my loving father would say about this, and what the punishment the discipline I would receive in that if I were to do that. But it was healthy for me to have that boundary. So it's a reverence, it's an awe. There's a little bit of I would say discernment that's given when you have fear. Yeah. Instead of just willy-nilly not thinking about things before you do them. I think it's a healthy fear of the Lord that leads us as his children.
Yeah, and I'll add to that because in Lutheran tradition talk about the three uses of the law. So the law as curb, mirror, and guide. And in the first, on the front, it's the law as curb. And I think there's an aspect of the fear of the Lord where you're afraid. You're afraid of the consequences. If I do this foolish accent, like something contrary to one of the Proverbs in here, then I might get some bad things might happen to me, and I'm afraid of what that might be. And so and it's not like... So notice your motivation in that moment is not because I love the Lord so much. I would never want to do anything to displease him. I'm going to obey him in joy and in reverence. It's, I don't want punishment.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I don't want bad stuff.
I know what's going to happen if I do this.
But hey, it brings about obedience to the law. And that's a good thing at the end of the day.
Yep.
But then the better motivation, of course, is the third use of the law, which is like, this is a guide. I really want to please the Lord. This is my heart's desire. In my mind, I'm a slave to God. That's what it says in Romans chapter 7.
Yeah.
And so in my mind, I'm applying myself by the power of the Spirit to live this stuff out. And because I fear the Lord in the sense of I reverence him, I honor him in what I do. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah.
There's a lot in here. There's a lot about money. I really like the stuff it has to say about money. And I think we'll probably just maybe leave it with that one because we could go so many different directions. But in Proverbs chapter 11, it says 20 to 26, one person gives freely yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly but comes to poverty. A generous person will prosper. Whoever refreshes others will be refreshed. People curse the one who hoards grain, but they pray God's blessing on the one who is willing to sell. So I'm seeing a related theme, generosity. Generosity means good things for you. This is a good application of that earlier point we made where, you could take this, Proverbs chapter 11, verse 24, it says, whoever gives freely gains even more. Prosperity gospel, baby. No, that's not what it's really getting after. There's a general principle. If you refresh others, you will be refreshed. Generous people do prosper, but we don't. It's for the benefit of my neighbor that I'm giving. It's not, I'm going to give to you so that I know that I got a little something coming my way when I do that.
So that's the issue with the prosperity gospel. It's so opposite of the nature of Christ as a servant and as someone that considers someone other before themselves. So the prosperity gospel tells you to love someone so that you get something in back. That's not the gospel. The gospel is love someone despite whether gaining anything or back from them. And so that's the totally different. Like if you, like that is a dead ringer for if you're hearing the prosperity gospel versus the true gospel. The preacher will always say, do you not think God wants to bless you? So do this and then God will bless you. The intention is that you receive something from doing something for God. That's the intention behind it. That's the prosperity gospel. And people pull these scriptures all the time. And it's like 15 scriptures. And they'll continue to use these things over and over to make a case for how God wants you to have everything by doing some things that he says. But in the end, it's really all about what I can gain by hopefully doing something pleasing to God. Yeah,
so the principle of generosity, and generally it works out that you get a kickback in one form or another, whether it's joy. I recommend The Rainbow Fish for those who are looking for a good book on this. It's a children's book.
It's amazing.
The more you give away, the more happiness the character feels and experiences.
Well, I think in general, I mean, just doing something kind for someone, it just lifts your heart, lifts your, in general, I think in humanity, just doing something kind for someone, helping someone, there's just a lifting of our heart when we do those things. So,
And the inverse, of course, we see this in the Proverbs too. Probably just leave it here. Generosity, there's abundance. And when you're like, I don't want to be generous, I got to hold on to what I have. The proverb says, you'll come to poverty. So even what you have will be taken away from you. Think of the words of Jesus. So it's that the poverty of your spirit will lead to a poverty in reality. Which not always the case, right?
Not always the
Generally,
case.
Principle, not a promise. Yeah, but you see it play out in the lives of people.
Yeah.
But there's so much, like we said, there's so much in the book of Proverbs to really weigh in on. I mean, we talk about sexuality, talk about generosity, fearing the Lord. There's a lot, and we could go on and on. But the book of Proverbs, it is a gold mine of wonderful wisdom to live by in the fear of the Lord and in wisdom, and to experience thriving as Jesus would have us have it. So, and enjoy the reading, guys. I hope it's a really nice time.
Thanks so much for joining us for the Weekly Word. If you like this podcast, be sure to rate and subscribe and hit that notification bell to stay on top of new episodes. If you have any questions or have something in Scripture you'd like us to weigh in on, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at weeklyword@messiahmidland.org. That's weeklyword@messiahmidland.org.